All right, as the U.S. continues to grapple with the impact of the ongoing pandemic, we're hearing many Americans say they are not satisfied with the government's response to the crisis. According to a new article in The Atlantic, it's a result of the, quote, serious underlying conditions of a country living in a failed state. George Packer is a staff writer for The Atlantic, and he wrote that piece. He's also the author of Our Man, Richard Holbrooke and the End of the American Century, which is a fantastic book, by the way, if I do say so myself. And he's joining us now to talk about this. So, George, just give our viewers an understanding of your research. In what ways has the government failed the people as we face this pandemic?
Really in the most basic way, which is to give us true information that we need in order to understand what's happening, to give us instructions and guidance about how we should behave, and to organize a response that allows for vital equipment and testing to be distributed around the country as it's needed. None of those things have happened. And, you know, in the early days of March, when people were trying to figure out on their own, should I send my kids to school? Should I go into the office? I had an eerie feeling that I was back in the kind of country I used to report in, like Sierra Leone during the civil war there, or Iraq after the invasion, where no one could count on the government to either tell them what to do or give them advice or organize a response or care about them. And in that sense, it did feel as if we were a failed state. I know we don't meet the textbook definition, but in so many ways, our national government has failed to meet this challenge and left its citizens on their own, in some ways competing with each other, depending on what state or region they're in. All those things are the kind of things that should not happen in a great power in a modern state, and they've been happening here since early March.
So in your piece, you describe this pandemic as sort of the third major crisis that this country has seen in the 21st century. The first crisis being 9/11, the second one being the recession, one uniting us as a country, the other one tearing us apart. Can you describe how the two previous crises had an impact on the response to the coronavirus?
I think on 9/11, I was in New York that day, the overwhelming feeling among Americans was to come together, to show solidarity, to see New York as a symbol of the country that had taken a hit for the whole country. As we all remember, we who were adults back then, that unity began to disintegrate pretty quickly, especially with the Iraq War and the forever wars of the global war on terrorism. The 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession, I think, accelerated the disunity, the polarization. It began to divide us by class, by race, by political partisanship. And it also divided ordinary people from the institutions that we need in order to function. The distrust grew, the sense that elites were getting away with something that the rest of the country was suffering from. So by the time the coronavirus hit, I think our immune system was down, and our ability to respond as a country, a united country, was weakened. And I think those earlier crises turned out to have done a lot of damage to our ability to come together as a country when something as dire, you know, this kind of pressure was applied to us. It turned out the system wasn't going to work very well.
You know, I'm sure I'm not, I'm sure I'm just like a lot of my fellow Americans who, when they saw those long lines of people waiting to receive food at food banks, and who've seen the shortage of PPE, who have seen people turned away from testing, that a lot of people sort of think to themselves, how is this happening in what the mythology around the United States, which is, you know, the richest, the most powerful, the everything, the end all be all of republics. And your piece sort of digs into criticism of President Trump for how he has led the country, particularly during this pandemic. But I guess my question becomes, how much of the issues we are seeing now can we attribute to his presidency rather than it being a result of a long broken system? This didn't happen overnight. This is perhaps something that first started back in the 1960s or in the early 70s, perhaps with the way our politics changed with the election of LBJ or perhaps Richard Nixon. And I wonder how much of the past is now being felt now today in 2020 of things that have sort of systematically been sort of being whittled away over the course of the last 20 or 30 or 40 years.
I think you're right to look back in history and to go back 40 years or so. The other thing that began in the 70s was economic inequality began to widen and has been widening ever since. And we've seen the results of that every day in the way poor people, Black people, brown people have suffered from this crisis. People in working class jobs, which we now call essential work, and others have not felt it in the same way. So it's right to look back, but I see the Trump presidency itself as a symptom of that deterioration. The fact that we elected this man who was so obviously unfit during the campaign showed that that polarization and a sense of hostility to authority and to elites and to government itself, the sense that maybe government didn't matter that much. And we might as well put a reality TV star in charge of it because maybe he could do a better job than the professional politicians. That in itself was a sort of nihilistic impulse that we're now seeing the result of. For 3 years, we didn't feel it intimately, directly in our lives because there was no crisis. But we should have known that as soon as a crisis like this came, Trump would be incapable and really unwilling to meet it because he doesn't believe that government is answerable to its citizens. In a sense, he thinks that the government is answerable to him and him alone. He's governed that way. He's acted that way. He has hollowed out the civil service so that now when we need it, it turns out a lot of experts are missing, and those who are still there are under the thumb of an utterly politicized White House. So, yes, all this has been a long time coming. Under Trump, it became inevitable. I think other presidents would have been challenged to deal with this in a competent way, but with Trump, it was a foregone conclusion that the result would be disastrous.
So then, George, the question is, where do we go from here, right? A lot of people have said to me that they felt like this experience was going to result in a shift, that there would be sort of a new normal after the dust has settled. What will it take to fix this broken system? Could this crisis be the catalyst, or is it going to take another crisis?
I think this one has to be the catalyst because we don't get that many crises to fix it. I can only say I hope so. I hope that the lesson Americans take from this is that we need a competent, functioning national government, that we need experts to be able to tell us the truth without a political smokescreen, that we need an economy that doesn't regard those workers we now call essential as disposable, that we don't force, for example, meat packers to go back onto the job when the meatpacking plants are riddled with coronavirus, and that workers have basic protections, that they have paid sick leave and health insurance that now we see is essential but isn't there for so many of them, that we have an unemployment insurance system that works so that people can immediately get the help they need. We've allowed all of that to be neglected, to deteriorate, and I hope that this is enough. And I think a lot of Americans are waking up to the fact that so many of our vital institutions have been weakened, and we cannot afford to let that continue.
George Packer, thank you so much. If you want to hear more of what he has to say on this topic, you should check out his piece in The Atlantic. And of course, as Vlad pointed out, you are also the author of Our Man, Richard Holbrooke, and the End of the American Century. High reviews from Vlad and others. Thank you so much, George.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.